Data protection basics. Welcome to our short introduction to the wonderful world of data protection and in particular to the General Data Protection Regulation, also known and loved as GDPR. I would like to give you a brief overview of what data protection is all about, what the key principles and basic ideas of data protection are. It will not be a law lecture, no worries. I will not read out any articles from GDPR. It will rather be about what it actually means in real life and what you have to do and not to do in your everyday business. At the beginning, I'd like to do a little bit of marketing for GDPR because GDPR is much better than its reputation. There is a lot of panic mongering about data protection, and many lawyers earn a lot of money with this panic, but it's not really all that bad, and data protection is not completely pointless. After all, it's a fact that we live in a world in which incredible amounts of data are produced and in which very detailed profiles of people can be generated very quickly on the basis of this data. A certain search engine allegedly knows more about you than your spouse or even yourself, and I guess it makes sense to have certain rules for dealing with this mighty data. Before it gets too philosophical now, better let's get started. At the beginning, the quite elementary question, what is data protection actually all about? Data protection is not about protecting data, but about protecting our individual freedom. The central thought is, if I don't know what you know about me, I'll act cautiously as a precaution. And that's the end of my individual freedom. So the very basic idea is that everyone should be able to decide for themselves on the use of their personal data. And data protection is not about the protection of any kind of data, but specifically about the protection of personal data. Data that makes a natural person, not a legal entity or company or something, identifiable. Obvious examples: name, telephone number, email address. Not quite as self-explanatory anymore. IP addresses, even with dynamic IP addresses, at least the internet provider knows who at a specific point in time had a certain IP address, and that's enough to qualify IP addresses as personal data. Photos of a person are also personal data, even if there is no name on the photo. Somewhere there is always someone who can identify the person in the photo, and that is enough to qualify a photo as personal data. Well, actually, almost everything we leave behind in terms of data traces is somehow personal and falls under the rules of the data protection laws. On level 2 of data protection, there are the special categories of personal data: health data, religion, political views, and in other words, everything that is suitable for discrimination. And these special categories of sensitive data enjoy special protection and of course also require a higher level of protection. Health data, for example, can almost only be used with the express consent of the person concerned. Data protection law applies only to the processing of personal data by automated means, so basically data processing that happens in a computer. The data that you have in your head or in a chaos of nodes in the bottom drawer of your desk does not fall under the rules of GDPR. GDPR also does not apply to the names of the residents on the doorbell sign or on the code hook in the kindergarten. And there has been some excitement about these two examples in the context of GDPR, but that's completely unnecessary. That's not what GDPR is all about. And here we go. Let's talk about the key principles of data protection. So what are the basic rules and guidelines that must be observed? Number one, probably most important, is lawfulness. Surprisingly enough, the processing of data must be lawful. And data protection law follows a rather restrictive basic idea here. Everything which is not allowed is forbidden. That means I always need a legal basis if I want to touch and process personal data. And there are several legal bases to choose from, so let's have a quick look at some of them. First, the classic one, consent. The clear message, yes, I want you to process my data, or yes, I want you to send me your very interesting daily email newsletter. What does such consent have to look like? To put it very briefly, I must know what I'm consenting to. I must say yes quite clearly and explicitly, and I must be made aware that I can withdraw my consent at any time. Consent cannot be implied somehow by the way, hidden somewhere down in clause 17.3 of the general terms and conditions, but must always be declared clearly and unambiguously. And there is a special challenge for lawyers in GDPR. Consent must come in clear and plain language, and that is often not quite simple when you look at some of the consent monsters out there that nobody understands anymore. Standard example is the consent or opt-in to an email newsletter. This is how it would look like in a lawyer's perfect world. Very transparent what I'm consenting to here. How often will the newsletter hit my inbox? What is the newsletter about? And the link to more detailed information in the data protection policy. One of the major misunderstandings in data protection law has to do with consent. I do not always need consent if I want to process data. If I simply need the data in order to fulfill a contract with the person concerned, I can do so without consent. The legal basis is then quite simply the performance of the contract. Actually, pretty straightforward. The employer may process the employee's bank account number in order to transfer the monthly salary, hopefully, without the employee's consent. If you order something from Amazon, Amazon may process your postal address to send you a parcel, just for the performance of the contract and without explicit consent. In this context, let's take a quick look at data processing on behalf of the controller. I don't have to do all the data processing myself. I can also outsource it and use a service provider. However, if I engage a processor to process data for me on my behalf, I have to sign a data processing agreement or data processing addendum. And for such a data processing agreement, or DPA, our GDPR comes with quite detailed formal requirements. And here we have another big misunderstanding in data protection. Not everyone to whom I give data to do something for me is a data processor. Only if the processing of data is really the essence, the core of the contractor service, it's a data processor. If the processing of data is only kind of a secondary service, the contractor is not a data processor. For example, the plumber who processes my address to visit me and to repair my toilet is not a data processor. He processes my address to fulfill our repair my toilet contract. Typical example for data processors are the web hoster, where my website is sitting, and the letter shop sending out my Christmas cards, for example. Then we have compliance with a legal obligation as another legal basis. Very briefly, this is primarily about statutory data retention obligations from primarily tax law. If I have to retain data so that I can still show it to the nice gentleman from the tax office in, let's say, 8 years from now, then of course I'm allowed to do so. Tax law always stands out from all other laws, even from data protection law. And then, last but not least, my favorite legal basis, legitimate interest. With your legitimate interest, you can do great things and become really creative. Legitimate interest is about balancing of interests. On the one hand, my interest in processing your data. On the other hand, your right to be left alone. The whole thing works a little bit like a scale. I look at the interests on both sides and put small lead weights in the respective scales and see in which direction the scales tilt. And these lead weights can be very different factors. For example, what kind of data are we talking about? Do we have sensitive data like health information? That's not good. Is the data processing transparent? Can I object? Is the data encrypted? Can I reasonably expect this data processing, or is it completely unusual? In short, it comes down to the question of whether what I'm doing in terms of data processing feels somehow strange and dubious, or whether it's completely normal and feels okay. Classic example, the postal Christmas card. If you have the postal address of a customer, you may use it to send your customer postal advertising, as long as the customer has not objected. The legal basis here is this magic legitimate interest. Back to key principles. By the way, not all 7 key principles are as long as lawfulness. Don't worry, the next 3 are each just 1 or 2 sentences. So let's go. Purpose limitation. Basic statement, personal data collected for one specific purpose may not be used and processed for a new and completely different purpose in the future. You see, it's important to define the purpose sufficiently broadly and clearly when I collect data, so that I don't unnecessarily limit myself in the future if I could need the data for something else later on. Then we have data minimization. Short and sweet. I may only collect the data that I actually need, that is actually necessary for the fulfillment of the specific purpose. If my purpose is sending of email advertising, I don't need a postal address or date of birth or anything else, and I'm not allowed to ask for these fields in this situation. Storage limitation. I may only keep the data for as long as I need it for the specific purpose. In other words, once the purpose is accomplished, I have to delete the data, with the exception, of course, of data retention for tax purposes, as always. In practice, this means that I have to develop a retention and deletion policy. I have to define in concrete terms how long I actually keep which certain categories of data and when I have to delete the data. Standard example, I'm not allowed to keep job applications for all eternity. I have to delete the data of an applicant who has not been hired after a few months because I simply don't need that data anymore. I want to be able to decide for myself on the use of my personal data. That's what we said in the beginning. That's the basic idea. So I have to know what kind of data you collect and what you intend to do with my data. That's why transparency is the main idea, the overall concept of GDPR. About all this here, I have to inform you when I collect your personal data. Who actually collects the data here? Who is responsible? What are the purposes? Who will receive all the data? Does the data leave the European Union? How long will my data be kept, and how do I contact the data protection officer? The first thing that comes to mind when thinking about these information requirements is, of course, the privacy policy on the website. The website privacy policy, well, usually providing detailed information, very detailed, very lengthy information about which data is collected on the website, what kind of web trackers, analysis tools, and so on are running in the background and collecting my data when I visit a website. By the way, the privacy policy on the website shows pretty quickly whether a company has spent some time thinking about data protection or not, so that really should look okay. But of course, the information duties are not only about the website, but about every form of data collection. You also have to inform your customers whose data you collect for the performance of your contracts. If you organize an event, you must provide data protection information in the context of the event registration. And the employer must inform his employees about the processing of their data as well. A nice example is video surveillance. In the past, information was provided using a simple pictogram. Now it must be much more detailed in order to comply with the information requirements of our lovely GDPR. The so-called data subject rights are also intended to create transparency. Everyone can always ask for information about what data a company has stored about them, and everyone can demand copies of such data. And this right to information or right to access can be a lot. of effort and pain for a company, because it's not just about the data I have here on my servers, but also about the data that is held by my service providers, by my outsourced cloud services, whatever. And here I need a pretty good overview of my data processing and data flows in the company in order not to get lost. In my experience, the most complaints and the most annoyance in data protection comes from such data subject requests, or better, from not handling such requests professionally. It is really important to be prepared here and to act quickly, professionally, and friendly when such an access request letter comes across your desk. Okay, so far I need a legal basis for data processing. I may only process data for certain clearly defined purposes, and I may only collect the data that I really need. I may only store data for as long as I need it for the specific purpose. My data processing must be transparent, so I must provide detailed information about what data I collect and what I do with it. And now we come to confidentiality and integrity. In a nutshell, data must not get lost. I must ensure proper data security. I can wonderfully define the purposes of data processing and write lengthy, detailed retention and deletion policies. That's completely useless if I then put the data unsecured on a public server that is accessible to everyone, and everybody can download the data and do with it what they want. So data protection is worth nothing without data security, and that's why data protection law clearly says you must ensure that data is adequately protected, and you must take appropriate technical and organizational measures to ensure data security. And maybe not a too big surprise, under GDPR, these measures should also be documented somehow. This doesn't have to be a thick novel, but you definitely should have a short overview of your security measures in place. Some very basic security measures, very briefly. This is not an IT security training course here. Just by the way, we also offer a specific IT security training as well. Access rights. Access rights must be clearly defined and differentiated and gradual. Not everyone in the company must be able to access everything. Everyone should only be able to access the data they need for their job and nothing else. Your password should not be start123 or password 2020 or something like that, and passwords and accounts must not be shared. Excel lists with personal data should not be sent unencrypted by email. The monthly payroll with all employees and their salaries by email to the payroll provider or tax consultant, that's not a good idea. USB sticks, just 3 words about storing personal data or any kind of confidential information on USB sticks, they get lost. Also, storing personal data of the company in my private Dropbox is, well, not recommendable, let's put it that way. The filing cabinet with, for example, the personal files must be locked, and the key should be kept safely by the HR department. Okay. If then, despite all security measures, something goes wrong, and that can happen, you will have to inform the data protection authority. Exception only if there is no risk to the persons, to the data subjects affected. And this report is urgent. It must be made within 72 hours. Failure to do so could result in a fine, and a painful fine usually. And I may also have to inform the possibly huge number of persons affected by a data breach, namely if these affected persons are at high risk for their personal rights. Standard example here, the loss of passwords. The supervisory authorities believe in human laziness and assume that passwords are usually used uniformly for numerous providers, so if a password is lost, I am at high risk because the same password may be used to access my email account, my online banking, and my Tinder account as well. So if you lose a list with unencrypted passwords, you will have to inform all the persons affected from that data breach, and that can be a lot of persons. The last key principle, accountability. Basic statement, you must be able to prove that your data processing is in compliance with the law, that you basically have done everything always correctly. The idea behind that may be not too liberal. It's guilty until proven innocent. And that can be tough. This is like the police officer who stops you on your way home this evening from work and says, could you please be so kind and quickly prove that you have not done anything wrong today? And that's really not easy. One tool that helps here, the records of processing activities. This is the detailed documentation of all data flows in the company. This wonderful, colorful patchwork carpet here is an Excel sheet in which all data processing activities of a company are summarized. The basic idea of GDPR is once again transparency. You must know what data you have in your company, where it comes from, where it goes to, where it's stored, why you're allowed to process this data, and so on. This can, of course, be a lot of effort in the beginning, but once you have worked your way through it, it's a really good foundation for your data protection management. Sanctions. What happens if something goes wrong and if you don't play by the rules of GDPR? When I breach the rules and regulations of GDPR, I will learn to know the hefty administrative fines under the GDPR, 20 million euro or 4% of the global group revenues. Just as an example, that would be more than 8 billion euro for Volkswagen. Not bad. And the supervisory authorities use their power to issue fines. And they use this power in a way that really hurts the affected companies. Damages, more specifically immaterial damages for data protection infringements, can also become pretty expensive. These may be manageable amounts in individual cases, and a single data subject whose data has been lost in a data breach or something like that is unlikely to sue you for 100 euros. But if a smart lawyer collects and bundles 100,000 affected people, this can become quite unpleasant. Warning letters are also always nice. The unfavorable competitor or the Consumer Protection Association writing me a nice letter asking me to issue a cease and desist declaration, and also please to transfer the lawyer's cost note enclosed. And needless to say, in my opinion, damage to reputation in the area of data protection is usually much more unpleasant and painful than any fines anyway. So let's try to avoid that. And you did it. It's a wrap. You successfully completed the Data Protections Basics training. Thank you very much for your attention. Keep your data secure and have a great day.